The hotel receipt slipped from the pocket of my wife's light gray blazer just as I reached for the car keys. It floated to the kitchen floor in the middle of a bright Saturday morning, landing face up as if fate wanted me to read every painful word. The date at the top froze my heart. It was our wedding anniversary. The hotel name was only 30 minutes from our home. 2 guests. Late afternoon check-in. Early evening check-out. And written neatly across the bottom was a second name I recognized instantly. Her ex-boyfriend, Gavin Mercer. In one breath, 12 years of marriage suddenly felt like a carefully built house collapsing into dust. If you believe kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances still matter in this world, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who believes people can change, and subscribe to our channel to become part of our growing community. Stories like this remind us that life is rarely as simple as it first appears. I stood in our sunlit kitchen unable to move. The smell of fresh coffee still drifted through the house, birds sang outside the open window, and soft rays of morning light covered the dining table where we had shared breakfast less than an hour earlier. Just minutes before, my wife had kissed my cheek, smiled warmly, and left for work, telling me she would be home early because she wanted us to spend the afternoon together. Everything about her had seemed ordinary. Nothing in her eyes hinted at secrets. My name is Grant Holloway. I am 41 years old, and until that morning, I believed my marriage was one of the strongest things in my life. We weren't perfect. We argued about bills, forgot birthdays now and then, worked too much, and occasionally fell asleep on opposite sides of the bed after stressful days. But I never questioned her loyalty. Never. My wife, Meredith, had always been calm, thoughtful, and dependable. She volunteered at community events, remembered every family birthday without needing reminders, and somehow found time to help neighbors even when she barely had enough energy for herself. Friends often joked that I had married someone too good for me, and I usually laughed because deep down I believed they were right. That little receipt made every happy memory feel suspicious. I picked it up with trembling hands. The amount charged wasn't large enough to suggest a vacation. It was simply one afternoon room reservation. The kind people booked when they wanted privacy. I checked the date again. Our anniversary. The day she told me she had to work overtime because her office was dealing with an important audit. That evening she had come home carrying flowers, apologizing for being late, and promising she would make up for missing lunch together. I had believed every word because trust had never required proof. Now proof sat in my hand, quietly destroying everything. I wanted to call her immediately. I wanted to scream. I wanted answers. Instead, I folded the receipt carefully and placed it in my wallet. Years earlier, my father had given me one piece of advice after surviving a painful divorce. Never make permanent decisions during temporary emotions. At the time I thought it sounded like something printed inside a greeting card. Now it was the only thing stopping me from driving straight to her office. The rest of the morning became unbearable. I tried mowing the lawn, but I kept pushing the mower over the same patch of grass. I tried reading emails, but every sentence blurred together. Even the family photographs hanging along the hallway suddenly looked different. Instead of reminders of joyful years, they became questions I could no longer answer. Had she stopped loving me months ago? Was I the last person to know? Had our anniversary meant nothing to her? By noon, I convinced myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe Gavin worked at the hotel. Maybe Meredith attended a business meeting there. Maybe someone else paid using his membership account. Each explanation sounded weaker than the last. I searched my memory for every mention of Gavin. She rarely talked about him. Early in our relationship she had explained they dated seriously in college before ending things because their lives were moving in different directions. She said they hadn't spoken in years. I had never felt threatened by someone who belonged entirely to her past. Until now. Around 1 o'clock I drove into town under a cloudless blue sky. Families filled the sidewalks. Children chased pigeons near the fountain in the square. Couples laughed outside cafes while sunlight reflected off storefront windows. The world seemed painfully normal. I parked across from the hotel listed on the receipt. It looked elegant but ordinary. Business travelers rolled suitcases through the entrance while staff greeted guests with practiced smiles. Nothing about the building suggested it could quietly destroy a marriage. I didn't go inside immediately. Instead, I sat in my car watching people come and go, hoping somehow my fear would disappear. It didn't. Finally I walked through the revolving doors. The lobby smelled of polished wood and fresh flowers. Everything inside looked spotless. At the reception desk stood an older woman arranging reservation folders. I almost asked whether my wife had stayed there, but the words never left my mouth. Even if she wanted to help, privacy policies meant she probably couldn't. And honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted confirmation. As I turned to leave, something unexpected caught my attention. A large bulletin board near the conference rooms displayed photographs from recent charity events hosted by the hotel. One picture stopped me completely. Meredith stood smiling among volunteers wearing matching blue shirts. Beside her stood Gavin. My chest tightened. The photo had been taken on our anniversary. At first glance it seemed harmless. People volunteer together all the time. But why had she hidden it? Why lie about working late? Why hide seeing Gavin? Questions multiplied faster than answers. Before I could examine the picture more closely, a cheerful employee approached and explained that the hotel had hosted a regional charity fundraiser that afternoon for local veterans and families recovering from storm damage. I thanked him politely, pretending I was simply looking around. As I walked back toward the parking lot, my emotions became even more confused. The fundraiser explained why Meredith might have been there. It did not explain the hotel room. Nor the receipt. Nor why Gavin's name appeared beside hers. Driving home felt longer than ever. The bright afternoon sunlight now felt harsh instead of comforting. When I arrived, I found our elderly neighbor, Eleanor, watering flowers near the fence. She had known us since we bought the house. Without realizing how desperate I sounded, I asked if Meredith had ever mentioned reconnecting with old friends. Eleanor smiled gently. She said Meredith had been helping someone through a difficult personal situation lately but promised not to share details because she had given her word. That answer only deepened the mystery. Helping someone. Keeping promises. Meeting an ex. A hotel. Nothing fit together. Back inside the house, I opened our anniversary photo album. Every picture showed genuine smiles. Camping trips. Road trips. Family picnics. The afternoon we adopted our golden retriever, Bailey. Snowball fights. Birthday cakes. Hospital visits when Meredith stayed beside my mother's bed every single day after surgery. Could someone capable of that kind of loyalty truly betray me? Or had I already begun rewriting our history because of one receipt? The front door opened just after 4 in the afternoon. Meredith walked inside carrying grocery bags and smiling exactly the way she always did. Sunlight followed her through the doorway. She looked tired but peaceful. She had no idea the receipt rested inside my wallet only a few feet away. She hugged me gently and apologized again for having to work so much lately. I hugged her back automatically. For the first time in our marriage, I wondered whether I was embracing the woman I knew, or someone I had never truly understood. I barely tasted dinner that afternoon. Meredith had prepared grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and the homemade bread she always baked whenever she felt our lives had become too busy. Normally I would have complimented her cooking before taking the first bite, but every movement now felt rehearsed, as though I were acting in someone else's marriage. The receipt remained folded inside my wallet in my back pocket, growing heavier with every passing minute. Meredith noticed my silence almost immediately. She asked if work had been stressful, if I was feeling sick, if I had slept poorly. Her concern seemed genuine, and that only made the confusion inside me worse. If she had betrayed me, she was hiding it with heartbreaking ease. If she hadn't, then I was slowly poisoning our marriage with suspicion. The afternoon sunlight poured through the dining room windows, casting warm golden patterns across the table where we had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and countless ordinary meals that had once felt so safe. Bailey rested beside Meredith's chair, patiently waiting for a piece of bread to fall. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt familiar anymore. After lunch, Meredith carried a box of old paperwork into the living room, explaining that she wanted to organize documents before tax season. She invited me to help, hoping we could finish quickly and spend the rest of the afternoon together. I agreed, mostly because I wanted to watch her more closely. Every smile, every glance, every small hesitation now seemed like evidence waiting to be interpreted. While sorting papers, I noticed several envelopes from local charities. Meredith had always volunteered more than she talked about, quietly donating time instead of seeking recognition. She never posted photos online or told friends about the people she helped. It was simply part of who she was. Looking at those envelopes reminded me why I had fallen in love with her. She had a habit of putting other people before herself. That memory clashed painfully with the receipt. A few minutes later, Meredith received a phone call. She looked at the screen, hesitated for only a second, and stepped into the backyard to answer it. Through the large glass doors, I watched her pacing slowly across the patio while speaking in a low voice. She wasn't smiling. She looked worried. Every instinct urged me to open the door and listen. Instead, I remained where I was. Trust and suspicion were pulling me in opposite directions. When she returned, she simply said someone from the community center needed to reschedule a volunteer meeting. She sounded believable. Too believable. By early afternoon she suggested we drive to the local farmers market, something we often did together on weekends. I almost declined, but then realized being around other people might help me think more clearly. The market was full of life. Fresh flowers lined the entrances, children carried ice cream cones, musicians played cheerful acoustic songs, and elderly couples wandered hand in hand between produce stands. It should have been impossible to feel lonely surrounded by so much happiness. Yet I had never felt more alone. Meredith laughed while tasting locally made jam and insisted we buy a jar of blackberry preserves because it reminded her of our first camping trip together. She squeezed my hand the same way she always had. I wanted to believe every touch. I wanted one undeniable reason to throw the receipt away and laugh at myself for overreacting. Instead, fate had something else planned. As we approached a flower stand, a familiar voice called Meredith's name. She turned. Standing only a few feet away was Gavin Mercer. He looked older than I remembered from the few college photographs Meredith had once shown me. His blonde hair had started turning gray around the temples, and deep lines surrounded his eyes. He wasn't the confident young man I had imagined all morning. He looked exhausted. The three of us stood frozen for a moment. Meredith's smile disappeared. Gavin looked equally uncomfortable. He greeted both of us politely, asking how life had been. His voice carried none of the confidence I expected from someone supposedly involved in an affair. If anything, he seemed nervous. Before I could say much, another woman walked over pushing a stroller with a little girl inside. Gavin immediately introduced her as his wife, Charlotte, and proudly introduced their daughter. That single moment shook my assumptions. A man secretly having an affair usually didn't introduce his wife so naturally. Charlotte smiled warmly and thanked Meredith again for everything she had done for their family. Everything she had done. Before I could ask what she meant, the little girl reached toward Meredith with both hands, laughing happily. Meredith hugged her gently, kissed her forehead, and handed her a small stuffed rabbit from one of the shopping bags. The child clearly adored her. After a few more minutes of conversation, Gavin's family continued through the market. I stood silently beside Meredith. Questions were multiplying faster than answers. When I finally asked how often she saw Gavin, Meredith admitted they had recently reconnected through a local charity after his family experienced serious financial hardships following the closure of the manufacturing company where he had worked for nearly 20 years. She explained that Charlotte had been recovering from major surgery while Gavin struggled to find work. Everything she said sounded compassionate. Reasonable. Still. She had never told me. Not once. Back in the car, the silence became unbearable. Finally I asked why she had hidden all of this. Meredith stared through the windshield for several long seconds before quietly admitting that she feared I would misunderstand. That answer stung. Keeping secrets to avoid misunderstanding often creates exactly the misunderstanding people fear most. We drove home without another word. Late that afternoon, while Meredith unpacked groceries, I walked into my home office and opened my wallet. The receipt was still there. I unfolded it once more. This time I noticed something I had overlooked before. A handwritten number appeared beside the room charge. Room 318. For some reason, that detail felt important. I searched online for the hotel's floor plan and discovered something unusual. Room 318 wasn't located with the standard guest rooms. It was connected to a private conference suite frequently reserved for charity meetings and donor consultations. Hope flickered inside me for the first time all day. But hope wasn't proof. I needed certainty. The following afternoon, while Meredith attended another volunteer event, I returned to the hotel determined to uncover the truth once and for all. The same older receptionist recognized me. Perhaps she noticed the exhaustion on my face because she gently asked whether everything was all right. For several seconds I debated whether to tell her anything. Then I quietly explained that I wasn't trying to invade anyone's privacy. I simply needed to know whether I was about to lose my marriage over a misunderstanding. She listened patiently. Although she couldn't discuss guest information, she did explain something unexpected. The hotel occasionally issued temporary room receipts for conference suites because their booking software treated certain meeting spaces like hotel rooms. Groups using those suites often received paperwork that looked identical to overnight guest receipts. It wasn't confirmation. But it was enough to make me question every conclusion I had reached. As I thanked her and turned toward the exit, someone called my name. It was Eleanor, our elderly neighbor. She had been leaving a fundraising luncheon hosted at the hotel. She smiled warmly before becoming unexpectedly serious. She said there was something Meredith had wanted to tell me for weeks but kept postponing because she wanted everything to be perfect first. Eleanor refused to reveal the secret, explaining it wasn't hers to share, but she placed one hand gently on my shoulder and said something that stayed with me long after she walked away. She told me that sometimes love looks exactly like secrecy until the whole picture finally comes into focus. Driving home, I replayed those words again and again. The receipt had convinced me my wife had betrayed me. The hotel employee had introduced uncertainty. Meeting Gavin's family had complicated everything. Now Eleanor's mysterious comment suggested there was still a much larger truth hidden beneath everything I thought I knew. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Meredith sitting alone on the front porch in the warm afternoon sunlight. She wasn't reading. She wasn't looking at her phone. She simply sat there holding an old photo album against her chest, staring across the quiet neighborhood as though carrying a burden that had finally become too heavy to hide. The moment she looked up and saw my car, tears were already forming in her eyes. For the first time since finding the receipt, I realized she might have been carrying her own heartbreak all along. Meredith looked at me with the kind of sadness that only comes from carrying a burden alone for far too long. The warm afternoon breeze gently moved the loose strands of her hair, and the golden sunlight that usually made our front porch feel welcoming suddenly felt painfully quiet. She wasn't avoiding my eyes anymore. In fact, she looked almost relieved, as though she had finally reached the point where hiding the truth had become more exhausting than revealing it. I sat beside her without saying a word. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. We simply listened to the birds in the nearby trees and the distant laughter of children playing farther down the street. Finally, I reached into my wallet and placed the hotel receipt between us. "I found this," I said softly. The color drained from Meredith's face. She didn't deny recognizing it. She didn't pretend it belonged to someone else. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, took a slow breath, and nodded. "I knew this day would come," she whispered. Every painful possibility rushed back into my mind. She gently picked up the receipt, carefully smoothing the folded edges with trembling fingers. Tears rolled down her cheeks before she could stop them. It wasn't the reaction of someone caught in a lie. It looked more like the reaction of someone who had desperately hoped to protect someone they loved but had unintentionally caused even greater pain. She looked directly at me. "I never betrayed you, Grant. But I understand why you believe I did." Those words didn't erase my doubts. They simply opened the door to hear the rest. Meredith walked inside and returned carrying the old photo album I had noticed earlier. She placed it on the porch table and slowly opened it. Instead of family photographs, it contained newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, hospital papers, charity brochures, and several sketches of what looked like a renovated building. I looked at her in confusion. She smiled through her tears. Almost a year earlier, she explained, Gavin's family had experienced a devastating series of tragedies. The factory where he worked had closed unexpectedly, leaving hundreds unemployed. Only weeks later, Charlotte required major surgery that wasn't fully covered by insurance. Their savings disappeared within months. They quietly sold their home and moved into a small apartment while trying to rebuild their lives. Meredith had discovered their situation completely by accident during a community fundraiser. At first, they barely recognized one another after so many years. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes. But when Meredith learned how difficult life had become for Gavin's family, she couldn't ignore it. She remembered how Gavin's mother had once helped her own family after her father lost his job decades earlier. That kindness had stayed with her for years. Now she wanted to return that kindness, not because Gavin had once been her boyfriend, but because someone had once shown compassion to her family when they had nothing. She began volunteering alongside several local organizations helping families recover financially. Gavin and Charlotte joined those same projects because they wanted to give back despite their own struggles. Little by little, Meredith learned that Charlotte dreamed of opening a children's reading center where families who couldn't afford books could bring their children after school. The dream seemed impossible. Until Meredith decided to do something extraordinary. The sketches inside the album were plans for renovating an abandoned community building into that very reading center. Over the past 11 months she had quietly organized charity events, fundraising dinners, silent auctions, and business sponsorships. Dozens of volunteers had contributed. Eleanor. The hotel staff. The local businesses. Even several of our neighbors. Everyone had been helping. Everyone except me. Not because she didn't trust me. Because she wanted it to become our anniversary surprise. I stared at her, unable to understand. What does that have to do with the hotel? Meredith carefully removed another document from the album. It was a reservation agreement. Room 318. The conference suite. The hotel had donated its meeting space free of charge for planning sessions, donor meetings, and volunteer coordination. Their reservation software automatically printed conference bookings as room receipts. Then she showed me another page. The names listed together weren't guests. They were meeting organizers. Granting access required 2 signatures. One belonged to Meredith. The other belonged to Gavin because he coordinated volunteers from the construction team. The receipt I found had never represented a hotel stay. It represented months of planning. Months of compassion. Months of hope. I sat there speechless. Everything suddenly fit together. The charity photo. The conference room. The fundraiser. Charlotte thanking Meredith. The stuffed rabbit for their daughter. Even Eleanor's mysterious words. Love had looked exactly like secrecy because Meredith had been protecting a surprise she believed would bring joy instead of suspicion. Still, one question remained. If this was for us, why didn't you tell me after I found out you were working with Gavin? Meredith looked down at her hands. Because by then I had already made the mistake of hiding it for too long. Every day that passed made it harder to explain. I was afraid that if I suddenly told you everything, it would sound like an excuse instead of the truth. She wasn't wrong. If she had told me only after I confronted her, I probably wouldn't have believed her. She reached into the album one last time. This time she handed me an envelope. My name was written across the front in her familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter she had planned to give me on our anniversary after the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the reading center. She wrote about our marriage. About the countless ordinary days that had quietly become the happiest years of her life. She thanked me for always believing in helping others, reminding me how we had once promised that if life ever blessed us with enough, we would use part of it to bless someone else. She admitted she wanted the reading center to become our anniversary gift to the community. Instead of exchanging expensive presents, she wanted us to give children a place filled with books, hope, and imagination. At the bottom of the letter were words that completely broke me. The greatest love stories aren't measured by what two people keep for themselves. They're measured by what they choose to give away together. I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. For nearly 2 days I had allowed fear to rewrite 12 beautiful years of marriage. One receipt had convinced me I knew the whole story. In reality, I had only been holding one tiny piece of it. I apologized through tears for letting suspicion grow instead of asking for the truth. Meredith apologized for believing that keeping such an important secret, even for a beautiful reason, wouldn't create distance between us. Neither of us had been trying to hurt the other. We had simply made different mistakes. That afternoon, instead of allowing those mistakes to divide us, we chose honesty. The following weekend, under bright blue skies and warm sunshine, the renovated reading center officially opened. Families from across the community gathered outside the beautifully restored building. Colorful balloons floated above the entrance while children eagerly waited to explore shelves filled with thousands of donated books. Charlotte cried openly as she cut the ribbon. Gavin stood beside her holding their daughter's hand. Eleanor smiled proudly from the front row. The hotel staff attended. Local volunteers celebrated together. No one spoke about receipts or misunderstandings. They spoke about generosity. About second chances. About neighbors refusing to let difficult seasons define someone's future. Before everyone entered the building, Charlotte surprised Meredith by inviting her to place the very first children's book onto the center's main display shelf. Meredith chose a story about forgiveness. When she looked at me across the room, we both smiled through grateful tears. Months later, our marriage felt stronger than it had before the misunderstanding. Not because difficult moments never happened, but because we learned that silence can sometimes be just as dangerous as dishonesty. Love grows strongest where truth has room to breathe. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever judged a situation before knowing the whole truth, or has someone ever misunderstood your good intentions? Leave a meaningful comment below because your story might encourage someone else who is struggling today. And if this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. As we drove home that sunny afternoon, Meredith reached across the center console and gently held my hand. The same road we had traveled countless times suddenly felt different. I realized trust isn't built by never facing doubt. It's built by choosing honesty when doubt appears, by listening before judging, and by remembering that love deserves conversations, not assumptions. Sometimes the smallest piece of evidence can tell the biggest lie when it's missing the rest of the story. And sometimes, the strongest marriages aren't the ones that never break under pressure, they're the ones where two imperfect people choose, again and again, to rebuild with truth, grace, forgiveness, and hope. The receipt that nearly ended our marriage eventually became a reminder tucked inside our anniversary album, not of betrayal, but of the day we learned that real love isn't proven by perfect moments. It's proven by the courage to believe in each other long enough to discover the whole truth.